Let's go now to our first session. We're delighted to welcome our first group of high-level speakers. We have Mr. Goh Chok Tong, the former Prime Minister of Singapore and the Emeritus Senior Minister. Mr. Jean Chrétien also joins us. He's the former Prime Minister of Canada. Mr. Yasuo Fukuda, the former Prime Minister of Japan. Mr. Steve Orlins, who we all know is the President of the National Committee on United States-China Relations, and Mr. Zheng Peiyan, the former Vice Premier of the State Council of China and also chair one of our host organizations, CCIEE, here today. But may I please invite first to speak Mary Robinson, the former President of Ireland and the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and in her current role as chair of the Elders. I'm sure we all know, but of course the Elders is this phenomenal group of independent global leaders who work together to advance the human condition through peace and justice and human rights. They've been involved in conflict resolution, looking at the root causes that create those conflicts, and also work very ably, not only publicly, but particularly through private diplomacy. President Robinson has worked extensively in recent years in climate change, but more deeply in climate justice, looking at the social inequities that continue to divide us as a world. Mary Robinson, thank you very much for being with us here today. You have such extensive experience in mediating and in bringing people together. From where you sit, what would you tell us here today?
Well, thank you, James, and Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and indeed good evening. It's an honor to speak to you today at this time when global dialogue and collaboration have never been more important. And I must say, I agree with Dr. Fung that a good relationship between China and the United States is most important of all. We're nearly 2 years into a devastating global pandemic that has exposed not just failures of global pandemic preparedness, but wider weaknesses in the architecture of the rules-based international order. The current Sino-U.S. tensions have undoubtedly made it harder to coordinate a sustainable recovery from COVID-19 and address the wider existential challenges faced by all of us. Open dialogue is essential to rebuilding trust between China and the United States, to tackling the existential threats facing humanity, from pandemics and the climate crisis to the ever-present risk of nuclear conflict. I've always valued open and frank dialogue with senior leaders in China, including on the visits I made as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and most recently with President Xi on a visit to Beijing in 2019 as chair of the Elders, just as I have on many visits to the United States, including our 2 board meetings of the Elders held in Washington, D.C. earlier last year. As the world's most powerful nations, China and the United States should be leading the way to develop long-term solutions to common threats. Yet too often in recent years, they've been locked in a dynamic of mutual suspicion and confrontation. According to a survey conducted by the Pew Research Organization in March 2021, 89% of American adults consider China to be a competitor or enemy rather than a partner. Similar surveys of Chinese opinion undertaken by the China Data Lab at the University of California, San Diego, have also shown a rise in negative Chinese perceptions of the United States, with the favorability on a scale of 1 to 10 dropping to 4.77 in May 2020 from 5.77 in June 2019. Competition between nations can, of course, be helpful and dynamic, but not if it curdles into nationalist aggression and obscures common interests. More efforts need to be made by both countries to build relationships among young people, women, cultural groups, and others. I would give as an example the 2021 Her Village International Forum, which links women leaders, and I had the honor of speaking there at the invitation of Yang Lan, chairperson of Sun Media group. The pandemic has reminded us of the fundamental interconnectedness of our world and the extent to which we are all vulnerable to the health risks from changes to biodiversity and climate and breaches to planetary boundaries. These challenges don't fit into the zero-sum game paradigm that has traditionally defined foreign policy, but require sustained, intense cooperation. In the face of such profound threats, it's crucial above all to uphold the right to freedom of debate and inquiry, and to have challenging conversations, both in public and in private. It's only through sometimes difficult exchanges that we can arrive at policies that work and endure. This was the case in the aftermath of the Second World War, when the United Nations was founded and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was agreed, forming the bedrock of the modern multilateral system. The opening line of Article 1 of the Declaration is as true today as it was in 1948. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. There's much I could say about how both China and the United States understand and implement their human rights obligations as set out under international law, but this is not the priority for my remarks today. Rather, I want to emphasize the particular responsibility that these two great nations have to work together to develop a new framework to tackle the existential threats of the 21st century. Last November, I attended the COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow, where I too was pleased to see the bilateral US-China declaration made by envoys John Kerry and Xie Zhenhua. The joint declaration at COP26 to enhance climate action in the 2020s was a good start, but much more needs to be done on both sides to translate summit words into concrete actions. For China, this means a more ambitious near-term target in time for COP27 in Egypt this November. To speak frankly, peaking emissions by 2030 is too late. According to Climate Action Tracker, China's current climate plan is consistent with a world where temperatures are 3 to 4 degrees Celsius higher than pre-industrial levels, with terrifying implications for life on Earth as we know it. An earlier peaking date is essential to align with the Paris goals and with President Xi's 2060 net zero target. China has a crucial opportunity here to be a dynamic leader on climate, and I hope its leaders seize the moment, building on its already impressive track record in renewable energy production. The United States must also overcome its political deadlock to deliver on pledges already made, including concrete steps to reduce its emissions and accepting its fair share of the long overdue $100 billion in climate finance to developing countries. Cooperation between China and the United States was crucial in securing the 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change and the wider UN 2030 Agenda for Development, with the Sustainable Development Goals at its core. And I always wear this badge to remind us of the SDGs. The language in the preamble to the SDGs powerfully articulates the values behind this collective endeavor and the obligations that the leaders of China, the United States, and over 190 other UN member states committed themselves to in 2015. And I quote briefly, "We are resolved to free the human race from the tyranny of poverty and want, and to heal and secure our planet. We are determined to take the bold and transformative steps which are urgently needed to shift the world onto a sustainable and resilient path." Such a need for bold and transformative steps applies just as much to debates on global peace and security as it does to climate and the SDGs. Again, China and the United States have particular responsibilities here as nuclear powers and permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. I certainly welcome, as did Dr. Fung, the statement earlier this month by all P5 states reaffirming the Reagan-Gorbachev declaration that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. But much more needs to be done, including at the upcoming review conference on the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In this regard, China offers a particular model of leadership. It is the sole P5 state to adhere to a no first use policy regarding its nuclear weapons. At a time when growing mistrust between states, combined with technological advancements, raises the prospect of a destabilizing new nuclear arms race, no first use is a critical doctrine that can diffuse tensions. And I hope that China will continue to show leadership in this area, particularly in constraining the development of its own nuclear arsenal. Of course, this would be facilitated by the current US nuclear posture review concluding in a way that furthers disarmament and de-escalation. As my fellow elder, Gru Brundtland, wrote last month in the Financial Times, the solution is not to double down on a costly nuclear arms race, but rather to seek dialogue and arms control negotiations to contain this threat. The challenges our world faces are legion. Too often in recent years, we have not seen ethical and bold leadership that is commensurate with the task ahead. But inspired by the words of my dear friend and the first chair of the elders, the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, I refuse to be a pessimist. And like him, I'm a prisoner of hope. I'm convinced that we can pool our collective talents and ingenuity to build a better world for future generations. There are and will be differences, but that is typical of human beings, and any family knows that. The world needs China and the United States to be working together, marshalling and complementing their respective strengths and developing robust frameworks for 21st century governance, sustainability, and prosperity. It is in this spirit that I hope your discussions will continue and new ideals will bloom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary Robinson, for being with us. It's close to 1 a.m. in Dublin, Ireland. So we thank you in particular for choosing to be with us here today in person. And also, of course, we express our condolences on the very recent passing of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And we always remember Mr. Kofi Annan, your predecessor chair over at the Elders. We are going to be joined now by Mr. Goh Chok Tong over in Singapore. We're just going to confirm that he is with us at the moment. Yeah. Mr. Goh, good morning in Singapore, and thank you very much for being with us again. Of course, you joined us at our inaugural conference in Hong Kong in 2019, for which we were immensely grateful. Mr. Goh was first elected to Parliament in 1976 and remained as a representative there for 44 years. He served as Minister of Trade and Industry, of course, as Singapore's Prime Minister, and then remaining in Cabinet as Singapore's Senior Minister. Mr. Goh, thank you very much, and please deliver your words to us.
Well, good morning and also good evening. Thank you for inviting me to the third edition of the Hong Kong Forum on US-China Relations. The world has changed beyond recognition since I last spoke at the inaugural forum in 2019. What remains unchanged is the global strategic importance of US-China relationship. Let me first speak on how I see the problem before suggesting how best to move forward. If trust is the currency of the realm, then the main deficit in the geopolitical ledger is the mutual strategic distrust between the US and China. It stems from a difference in values, ideologies, worldviews, political systems, and perspectives on global governance. If this distrust cannot be overcome, the world will be condemned like Sisyphus to roll the border of a contentious US-China relationship up a hill for eternity. The US has assessed that China is, in President Biden's words, daily earnest about becoming the most significant, consequential nation in the world. It views China as its main strategic competitor and a threat to American national security and values. The US has therefore bolstered its military capabilities in the Asia-Pacific and strengthened its alliances and partnerships through platforms like the Quad and AUKUS. It has also drawn attention to alleged human rights abuses in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, as well as to what it views as China's coercive behavior in other parts of the world. From Washington's perspective, China is not following the established rules of the global order, despite being a chief beneficiary. Instead, China is seeking to rewrite these rules in its favor. At best, China sees this as a US containment strategy to prevent its rise as a global power. At worst, it sees this as a long-term strategy to weaken China and break it up. It sees the US framing of democracy versus autocracy as a move to undermine China's political system and the dominance of the CPC. A similar ideological battle brought about the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Chinese leadership takes a view that foreign powers managed to exploit China in the past because it was not strong enough. Till today, Chinese leaders frequently remind its people of China's century of humiliation, including on the 100th anniversary of the founding of the CPC. Hence, China is building up multiple defensive and offensive capabilities at sea, in the air, outer space, and through cyber warfare. The ultimate weapon will be nuclear. The threat of mutually assured destruction is the best deterrence. China reasons that these capabilities are needed to protect its sovereignty and territorial integrity. But to the US, China's military buildup harbors offensive intent, particularly as it sees Beijing to be reluctant to engage in global discussions on managing the buildup of nuclear capabilities. With China, the US should instead scale down its immensely superior nuclear capabilities. At the recent virtual summit, President Biden called for common sense guardrails, while President Xi compared the two countries to two giant ships that must forge ahead together without colliding. Actions on the ground should reflect the two leaders' words. The US and China must see that it is in their own interests to maintain a stable and peaceful international environment. Both countries need to implement trust but verify agreements as they try to resolve outstanding bilateral issues while attaining their geopolitical ambitions. What now? Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said that the US approach to China will be competitive when it should be, collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must be. Building on this frame, I suggest that the US and China should avoid conflict over differences, embrace healthy competition, and maximize cooperation. My biggest concern is whether Taiwan becomes a casus belli. I do not think the mainland wants to invade Taiwan and reunify it through force. However, if it sees no prospect for peaceful reunification, it may believe it has no choice. Beijing has reiterated on countless occasions that Taiwanese independence is its red line. But the big unknown is what is a tipping point that would force the mainland to act. The more international space Taiwan gains, which Beijing sees as the result of tacit encouragement from the US, the more the mainland will ratchet up pressure on Taiwan. The US and China should negotiate guardrails to avert conflict over Taiwan. It is better to create the 21st equivalent of the red telephone than risk spiraling escalation and military conflict through miscalculation. Beyond merely avoiding conflict, the US-China relationship should be underpinned by healthy competition and driven by cooperation where possible. President Xi has said that we should advocate fair competition, like competing with each other for excellence in the racing field, not beating each other on the wrestling arena. President Biden has also said that the US would insist that China play by the international rules of fair competition, fair practices, and fair trade. Taken at face value, there is common ground to work together. The US and China will have to address what exactly healthy competition will look like in accordance with international law and the existing international rules-based order. There are many pressing global issues that require both the US and China to cooperate closely as global powers. Free trade, climate change, global pandemic preparedness, and religious extremism are a few of them. Besides the two protagonists, what can the rest of us do? I've been speaking about the voice of moderation since 2019. This voice represents the concerned countries, leaders, institutions, media, business, think tanks, and people who want to avert a catastrophic clash between the US and China. It advocates strategic rationality, peace, growth, and prosperity within an interdependent, open, inclusive, rules-based multilateral order. The moderate voice must urge the US and China to play a positive sum game, not a zero-sum game, and certainly not a negative sum game. All countries in the world want a positive and constructive relationship with both the US and China. Peace through acceptance of differences is a practical way forward. ASEAN is a prime example of how countries with very different geographies, histories, languages, and political systems came together to share a common vision of a peaceful and prosperous Southeast Asia. ASEAN can be a substantive voice of moderation. We have consistently encouraged both the US and China to remain productively engaged in the region across different sectors. Both countries are dialogue partners of ASEAN, and we hope to continue engaging both China and the US at ASEAN meetings at the highest level. Your forum, too, is a meaningful voice of moderation. I hope that when CUSEF and CCIEE convene the next forum, both major powers would have made good headway in managing their mutual strategic distrust. Doing so will require wisdom and statecraft of the highest order. I believe both Presidents Biden and Xi possess these qualities. I pray that they'll be able to build up strategic trust between their countries and peoples. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Mr. Goh Chok Tong for being with us here today. And good evening to Mr. Jean Chrétien, who was Prime Minister of Canada for 10 years and has served in many ministerial portfolios before then in foreign affairs, justice, finance, trade and commerce, and much more. Mr. Chrétien was also a guest here in Hong Kong at our inaugural forum in 2019. Mr. Chrétien, thank you very much for being with us, and please give us your address.
Bonsoir, I'm very pleased to be at the meeting again. I think that it's very important to have this kind of discussion with people from different parts of the world meeting and discussing, in fact, the problem that affect every one of us on a daily basis and will be for a long time, the relation between China and United States. And of course, there are problems, but you know, I've been around for a few years. I was involved in public life 60 years ago. And I followed the debate and I read the newspaper and the magazine all my life. And I never seen headlines telling that the world was working well yesterday. It's always problems and problems and problems. But when you look back, you see the progress we have made. You know, in 1945, what was the place of China in the world affairs? Not big. It was extremely difficult. You know, I was part of the Canadian government when 51 years ago, we recognized China. It was a big political problem in North America when we did that. But Americans followed and others, and now China has become, you know, the big power in the world. So necessarily that create problems. But when you look around the world, you realize the progress we have made collectively. You know, today, for example, we we're in 2 years in a pandemic that I was afraid was to cause fantastic economic problems around the world. And we have come out of it so far extremely well. Take the case we have in Canada. What are the problems we're having? It's the same than United States and many other countries. We have problems with shortage of labor. I spend my life talking about how to cure the problem of unemployment in Canada for generations. Now the biggest problem is if you don't find people to fill the hundreds of thousands of jobs that are available in Canada. And it looks it's the same thing in the United States. It's the same thing in many countries in Europe. You know, the growth of trade, for example, between Canada and necessarily United States, because we are a close neighbor and we have the same kind of economy. You know, we had a big increase of trade between Canada and China last year. And we're apparently having a lot of political problems. But, you know, the trade has continued. So I tend to be an optimist. I think if we have been able to go through this extremely difficult period, that could have been an extremely terrible recession. We have seen growth around the world. The wealth is keep being creating on a daily basis. The growth in Asia, the wealth that we see now that did not exist 30, 40 years ago, has increased the wealth of the world. You know, there is more money available in the world that we ever have. We still have major problems, but there is a reality that, for example, there is around the globe a lot less people who are starving to death like it was the case 30, 45, 50 years ago. the people getting education, when it was a huge problem, is getting improved every year, and there is less and less people around the globe who don't receive education as it was the case in years past. So for me is that, of course, the American need China and China need America. China needs Canada. China needs Europe, and vice versa too. So we need to work together, and we always will find some solution. There is always a written. There will always be problems. There is not a day in public life that, I used to make the joke when I was going to my office, I would say, if you want to give me one if you cannot give me one good news, don't give me any bad news, because news are never good. But we have managed to resolve the problem of the world. So what is important is, as Madame Robertson was talking before, and Mr. Ghost said too, it's dialogue. It's what we're doing right now. 50 years ago, who would have thought that we would have a conference, across continent, talking and seeing each other. And there is dozens and dozens of these type of meetings that build the mentality in every country to say, let's find solution. Of course, the problem of nuclear disarmament exists since 1945. But the equilibrium of terror will probably make sure that nobody will ever use it, because it would be absolutely stupid to use it. Climate change is a new challenge. But I look at that and I see the commitment that everybody is making. It will never be perfect. We will have goals that probably we will not achieve neatly, but we're moving in that direction. And everybody wants to move in that direction. And the science and the new technology and the opportunity change on a daily basis. So my conclusion is very simple. We have to keep talking, and nobody wants to a war. Everybody wants to create wealth. And for me, if I can make one pitch, is if we want to maintain a good balance in the world, we have to work on one problem that affects every country, is sharing the wealth that we are creating. One of the problems of the last 10 years is that rich are getting richer on a daily basis, and the poor are not increasing accordingly. And if we don't attack this problem, that will create a lot of civil disturbance in many places around the globe. So, we have to keep that in mind. If we don't solve this problem, we will have internal problems in every country around the world. And if we can do that, and it is possible to be able to share more among the people of every country, there will be more happiness. And when people are happy and are optimistic, there is no danger for fatal problem. So merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Mr. Chrétien. Let's move now to Japan, where it's just gone 10:20 in the morning, where we're joined there by Mr. Yasuo Fukuda, who began his career in public service as Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister in around 1976, then joining the House of Representatives and then becoming the 91st Prime Minister of Japan, in that time carving out a reputation for his special work on environmental issues and also in Japan-China relations. Mr. Fukuda, thank you very much for being with us again at this forum. You were with us a couple of years ago, and welcome back. Please give us your keynote address.
As we look forward to 2022, we hope that this year will be one of renewed hope. For the past 2 years, the world has been rocked by the COVID pandemic, but we hope this year will be a year of dawning solutions. Finally, the Beijing Winter Olympic and Paralympic Games will be held. There will be many difficulties, but I hope that everything will be accomplished with success. I'm very happy to see lots of old friends. And for this new year, we all have new hopes. Especially in the past 2 years, the world has been affected by the COVID pandemic. So we hope that this year we will have a year of solutions. The Beijing Winter Olympic Games and Paralympic Games will be held. There will be many difficulties, but I hope that everything will be accomplished with success. It is worth remembering that the Tokyo Olympics and the Paralympics were held in Japan last summer, a year later than originally scheduled. The Tokyo Olympics and Paralympics, as you know, had a tortuous journey. First of all, due to the global spread of COVID, the Olympic Games were postponed by 1 year to last summer. There was a lot of debate about whether it was really appropriate to hold the Olympic Games in the pandemic. And some people even said that it should be cancelled or postponed further. The organizers, the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, and the people involved in the Games, who had assumed for a long time that the Games would be held, had high hopes for the Games to be held. So did each and every athlete in the world who had worked so hard to achieve this day. As a result, it was decided to go ahead with the Games under the drastic policy of no spectators, meaning that there would be no visitors other than those involved in the Games. The idea of no spectators seemed far-fetched. I myself was skeptical at first, wondering if it could be called a sports game without an audience. But when I thought about it, I realized that we should take into account the fact that, unlike in the past, television is now a global phenomenon. The technology for filming has improved, and the filming equipment, especially high-resolution TV cameras, capable of capturing extremely detailed images such as 4K and 8K, has become widespread. Given this, it is easy to see how the game can be much more accessible than going to the stadium and watching it from a distance. It is true that some of the athletes said that without the spectators, they would not be able to fight, or that the cheers of the spectators would make them work harder. But many of them also said that it was good to be able to concentrate on their own game. In fact, I am sure that the athletes left the stadium feeling satisfied that they had given their all to their performances, and that in this age of television, people were able to enjoy their favorite players and games while watching them in their respective countries. So for the athletes, that was also a very satisfactory solution. Rather, it is also with great satisfaction and admiration that the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, the government of Japan, and many others involved in the Olympic and the Paralympic Games had managed to pull it off without the disruptions of the pandemic. So we hope that Beijing will also be able to repeat the experience in Tokyo, and that it will be just as successful, if not even more so. And we will look forward to watching the Olympic Games in action in front of our TV sets. On the international front, the issue of the year will be the US-China relationship. And the longer the conflict between the US and China continues, the more easy the international situation will become. I'm not prepared to limit myself to pessimism about US-China relations. Our understanding from the virtual US-China summit late last year is that President Biden believes that a confrontation between the US and China is not inevitable, and that he will do everything in his power to ensure that the competition does not lead to a confrontation, and that he agrees with President Xi Jinping on this point. From the point of view of the United States, it seems to be aiming to turn the international public opinion against China by appealing to other countries to make a pretense of encircling China in response to China's moves in the South China Sea and democratic movements in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Taiwan. One of the issues that must be considered as part of the situation underlying such moves is the economic issue. And particularly important is the imbalance in trade between the US and China. That is how to balance the US deficit and the Chinese surplus. And this is probably the biggest issue. During the New Year's holiday, I had the opportunity to look at past documents and think about the fact that in the past, Japan also had a very difficult time in the same position as China today. This was about 40 years ago, in the 1970s. At that time, Japan was suffering from a trade surplus with the USA. Germany also ran a large surplus with the USA, although not as large as Japan's. Ironically, the defeated nations of World War II, Japan and Germany, had the upper hand, the international economy, at that time. The United States wanted to change the exchange rate drastically in order to reduce the trade gap. And in 1985, the G5 members convened at the Plaza Hotel in New York and decided to raise the exchange rate drastically for Japan and Germany. This decision was known as the Plaza Accord. What happened to Japan's exchange rate as a result of the Plaza Accord? The dominant view in Japan was the principle that the correction of trade disparities was to be achieved by raising the rate of the country with excess exports, which would reduce the volume of imports and thus reduce the trade deficit of the importing country. Japan responded to this principle by raising the exchange rate from 240 yen to the dollar at the time of the Plaza Accord to 160 yen by the end of the following year, an increase of nearly 70%. And 2 years later, at the end of 1997, to 120 yen, an increase of 100%. 2 years later, at the end of 1987, the exchange rate was raised by 100% to 120 yen. The result, of course, was that exports stagnated and the burden fell on domestic and manufacturers of exported goods, of which small and medium-sized enterprises were the majority. In other words, a recession followed a strong yen. In order to overcome this recession, the government cut interest rates. As a result, surplus funds went into land and real estate, creating a so-called bubble. Some of the surplus money went on to buy iconic US assets, such as the Rockefeller Center in New York, and the anti-Japanese momentum of the American people was quickly raised. Japan had let its economy run its course and finally done something that struck a chord with the US. Then came the US criticism of Japan. When the Gulf War broke out, sparked by Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the criticism of Japan doing nothing, and the US tried hard to contain the situation by offering 1.5 trillion yen or 13 billion US dollars. This sequence of events suggests that the US had taken Japan's moves well and had successfully dodged the trade deficit problem by making appropriate and sometimes excessive demands. To resolve the trade imbalance, it is necessary to adjust the exchange rate, but it is also necessary to change the nature of the economy, which causes the imbalance in the medium and long term. And in this respect, the US seems to have taken various measures, including the introduction of a free economy. However, in the context of a financial economy, its excesses led to the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which showed the limits of this system. While we were busy dealing with this, China had been growing in strength very rapidly and become a presence that the US cannot ignore. To put it simply, it is a matter of revaluation, of course, but also of the scale and duration of the revaluation. It took only a year or two to double the rate, a drastic move that could have taken a decade. Naturally, the impact on the domestic economy was huge. The interest rates were cut several times in a panic, leading to a bubble. What happened afterwards was that with the bursting of the bubble, stock prices plummeted, non-performing loans of financial institutions increased, Japan's big banks, which had been built on solidity, collapsed, leading to a financial recession, a restructuring of financial institutions, and a prolonged stagnation of industrial policy. If we look at this as a whole, the failure of Japan's economic policy is not that it made a mistake in revaluing the exchange rate itself, but that with the right revaluation and the right domestic measures, it would have been a force for restraining trade friction, and that the most natural way to adjust the exchange rate is to use it. The current problem between the US and China is trade friction, and there are other ways in which countries with large trade surpluses must take action, such as increasing domestic demand and easing import restrictions, as Japan has done. Even if China were to make concessions on the issue of human rights, it would not help to resolve the trade problem. The US, which has been running a trade deficit for a long time, needs to do something to reduce it. It may need to change its economic system to one that earns more foreign currency, or to one that spends less. We are not alone in our wrestling. And we are always aware of the international community, and we are always thinking about the situation in other countries. We think that about climate change, we think about resources, food, and water. After all, we are part of a community of people who know that the survival of the whole planet depends on our own survival. In order to solve the problems between the US and China, I hope that the US and China will first discuss them thoroughly and find a solution. So in order to solve the problems, including climate change, water shortage, and poverty, we have to address these issues as they concern the development of the whole planet. In order to solve the problems between China and the US, which concern not only the two countries, but also the whole world. The problem between the US and China is also a problem for Japan. So how the US-China issue is resolved will undoubtedly have an impact on Japan. And the US-China relationship will also affect Japan's economy. So for Japan, we cannot stand by. We must help China and the US resolve their problems. We very much hope that China and the US can grow together. So these are the issues that I have pondered in the New Year holiday. Otherwise, we will have greater instabilities in the world. I hope that Beijing's Winter Olympic Games and Paralympic Games can be a great success in a brighter future. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Mr. Yasuo Fukuda for sharing your many thoughts with us. And as you said, it's very unique for Asia, two Asian cities, two Asian countries to be hosting two Olympics and Paralympics in the space of just 7 months. Let's go now to the United States, to Steve Orlins, who is the president of the National Committee on United States-China Relations, a role he has held since 2005. And I think if I remember correctly, Steve, you've not only lived and worked in Hong Kong and Beijing, but you also speak Chinese, and you were part of the original legal team that worked towards the normalization of the US-China relationship back in 78, 79. So you obviously bring with you incredible and historical insights all over again as they're reapplied in this 21st century. Steve Orlins, please speak with us now.
James, thank you. It's a great honor to be on this panel with so many great world leaders who've spoken with so much wisdom. I miss being there in person greatly. In fact, I'm remembering back to 50 years ago in 1972. Victor Fung knows this story, but he knows it. When I graduated college, I got on a plane and I went to Hong Kong. It's the first thing I did. I took the train to Luk Ma Chau, and with my binoculars, I looked across the border to China. Americans could barely get in then. It would be 7 years till I left the US State Department and crossed that border. But I would say it has now been 50 years since I have been away from Hong Kong for 2 consecutive years, as I have been as a result of quarantine. I miss the food. I miss the company. I miss the discussions. I miss seeing so many of my friends who are on this call tonight in the United States. And I hope that one day I can return without quarantine or with a more limited quarantine. Late last year in October, Foreign Affairs magazine asked 68 American foreign policy experts if US policy has become too hostile to China. And only 5, including me, strongly agreed that US policy was too hostile. My initial reaction was that while I was in the minority, agreeing with me were old friends like Jeff Bader, Dr. Chung Lee, and Ambassador Stapleton Roy, and that gave me a lot of comfort. I recalled that this was not the first time I've been in a minority view on US foreign policy. As an undergraduate at Harvard College, I stood with my classmates in opposition to the American government's war in Vietnam and watched as our minority view became the majority view of the American people. Years later, I stood in opposition to the American government's war in Iraq because, as a former international lawyer, as you mentioned, James, in the US State Department, I believed the invasion violated international law. So I'm comfortable in holding a minority view in our views towards China, yet I'm left wondering why and when my views stop being the majority view. What happened and what can we do about it? I think back to the National Committee's annual dinner in October 2005, when then Deputy Secretary of State Robert Zellick, who went on to become head of the World Bank, gave his now famous responsible stakeholder speech. He observed that the United States and China both benefit from working together and called on China to be a responsible stakeholder in the world system. He believed that engagement would lead to China's productive participation in the world system. Last month, I went to Broadway and I watched the play Lehman Trilogy, the story of the 154-year history of my former employer. As Victor certainly knows, and many others on this call, one of the times I lived in Hong Kong, I ran Lehman Brothers Asia. As I watched the play, I thought about how the United States and China cooperated during the financial crisis in 2007 and 2008. While Secretary Zellick, me, and a few others still believe in this concept, it is certainly a minority view today. So what happened? Beginning in 2009, China's reclamation activities in the South China Sea began to shift attitudes in Washington. Many asked, were these the actions of a responsible stakeholder? Many years later, the arbitral tribunal's decision on the Philippines suit confirmed their views that these actions violated international law. Around this time, China also began to limit media access and increase barriers for foreign workers and organizations operating in China. The blocking of Facebook, Twitter, YouTube in 2009, and Google in 2010 cut off a vital pathway for cultural and social exchange. it also increased distrust of China among Americans, especially the younger generation most active on social media. The subsequent blocking of major news outlets like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal beginning in 2012 only made matters worse. Alongside these media's restrictions on research and refusal to issue visas to American scholars also contributed to worsening relations. China's refusal to invite American scientists to Wuhan to understand COVID-19 fueled distrust and suspicion. Laws like the 2017 Foreign NGO Management Law also restrict the space for people-to-people exchanges and stifle opportunities for collaboration. By some estimates, there were around 5,000 foreign NGOs operating in China in 2016. As of December last year, only around 600 have registered with the Chinese government. This is a tremendous loss, not only for these organizations, but for China. Now, of course, I don't mean to suggest the US government hasn't had its share of mistakes. Those have been equally as devastating to the relationship. I could list them, I'll list just some of them. The arrest of Meng Wanzhou, the beginning of the tariff war, calling COVID-19 the Chinese virus, starting what became known as the China Initiative, emanating from the US Department of Justice, restricting China's state-owned media in the United States, pushing the envelope on unofficial relations with Taiwan, increasing freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, reducing CDC and National Science Foundation personnel in China, closing the consulate in Houston, overusing and doing with too little transparency our entity list and military lists, which ban doing business with Chinese companies, delistings, ending the Fulbright program and the Peace Corps in China, denying visas to too many of my friends in China, and lying about China interference in US elections. Well, you'd think with all of these problems emanating from both governments, I would be a pessimist, but I'm not. I'm not, because fundamentally, I believe that the peoples of both the United States and China recognize that the real threats to our societies are joint threats. As have been mentioned here tonight many times, climate change, economic crisis and stability, terrorism, and boy, do we know, pandemic. But what we need to do today is, we've heard tonight a lot about the overarching issues. I'm a believer that we need to create what I would call habits of cooperation. We need to create them in the short term. Victor Fung mentioned ending the tariffs that started on January 20th, 2017. We need to do it, and we need to do it now. We need to agree on a definition of national security so it doesn't become so broad that we can't do business with each other in areas that don't affect national security. We need to restart scientific and medical cooperation. We need to reopen the Houston and Chengdu consulates. We need to reaffirm the status quo on cross-strait relations. We need to go further down the road on readmitting American journalists to China so the American people can understand what is going on in China. I could go on with a number of other things we should be doing tonight, we should be doing now, but don't have enough time. But as I said, I'm an optimist, and I agree with President Xi. 我们有1000条例 有把美中关系搞好，没有一条理由把
There's
中
no reason to sabotage China-U.S. relations.
to get U.S.-China relations right, and not one reason to spoil the relationship. As I said at the beginning, just as my views on the Vietnam War went from the minority to the majority, I am convinced that I will again become part of the majority who want a more positive and constructive U.S.-China relations. It is in the interest of the American people, it is in the interests of the Chinese people, and it is in the interests of the world. 谢谢各位. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Steve Orlins, I believe, joining us from New York for your thoughts there. And last but not least, we are delighted to be crossing now to Beijing, where we're joined by the former Vice Premier of the State Council of China and the Chairman of CCIEE, Mr. Zheng Peiyan. Mr. Zheng, thank you very much for gathering us here today for this conference that your organization is jointly hosting. Of course, we know that Mr. Zheng, back in the early 1980s, lived in the United States in the Chinese embassy in Washington, and he's also been part of the leadership of major projects, including Three Gorges. He was vice premier in 2003. Mr. Zheng, please give us your address.
Mr. Zhang Christian, Mr. Goh Tong, Madam Robinson, and Mr. Fukuda-san. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation, and Chairman Orlins as well. Thank you very much for joining us and accepting the invitation to speak. It gives me great pleasure to join you for this forum discussing China-U.S. relations. This is an annual gathering, and I have confidence that this will turn out to be a very successful event. Currently, we are facing changes unseen in a century, and we also see the overlap of the pandemic challenges. Those challenges are intertwined, and those challenges are making world economic recovery difficult and tortuous. Inflation and financial risks are also gaining momentum, and we believe there are more uncertainties looming on the horizon. China-U.S. relations are arguably the most important relations in the world today, and that relationship has actually suffered the most difficult period since the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and the U.S. It has deviated from the right course. It is my opinion that a stable U.S.-China relationship is important for both countries, and it's also the common aspiration of countries around the world. On the 16th of November 2021, the Chinese and U.S. presidents held their first virtual meeting, and they held extensive and in-depth talks on strategic, overarching, and fundamental issues concerning China-U.S. relations and other important issues of concern. President Xi took stock of the experience and lessons learned in the development of China-U.S. relations and put forward three principles that shall undermine China-U.S. relations in the new era: mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation. I believe these three principles are very important and pointing to the direction of our future relations. And on this matter, I would like to share a number of observations. First, regarding mutual respect, we see this as a prerequisite for the development of Sino-U.S. relations. We should respect each other's social systems and development paths. The world is colorful and diverse, and China and the U.S. practice different social systems. A choice determined by history and the minds of our peoples. China has no intention to change the U.S., and the U.S. cannot force changes upon China. I think we should encourage each other to find a path that suits its national conditions and objectives. We should respect our comparative core interests and major concerns, and make sure we manage issues involving sovereignty, security, and development with a lot of prudence. We shall not cross the bottom line nor create troubles for the other. We should respect our rights to development, respectively, as China has the right to development and Chinese people have the right to pursue a better life. And a prosperous and stable China will bring not threats, but opportunities to the world. Mutual respect also means treating each other as equals. In our interactions, the U.S. talks to others from a vantage point of strength. This is typical of hegemonic thinking, and this kind of condescending approach should have been cast into the dustbin of history. We should adhere to the basic norms of international relations based on the Charter of the UN, where all countries, big and small, are equal. Second, on peaceful coexistence, this is the basis for the development of Sino-U.S. relations. Peace and development are the themes of our time, and the Chinese people have always been peace-loving and advocating peace. We respect harmony and difference. We believe in love and non-aggression. China has been a contributor of world peace, of global development, and a defender of international order, a supplier of public goods. The U.S. should not establish China as a hypothetical enemy by drawing ideological lines and satisfying the needs of some domestic interest groups, which may eventually lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. Peaceful coexistence needs to adhere to the bottom line of non-conflict and non-confrontation. It's only natural for China and the U.S. to have differences. It is crucial to abandon the obsolete Cold War thinking and mentality and confrontation. We should control and manage our differences constructively and strategically, avoid expanding and escalating differences. We should strengthen dialogue, exchange, and communication at all levels in all fields, enhance mutual understanding and trust, and avoid strategic miscalculation. Win-win cooperation is the goal of developing Sino-U.S. relations. With the further development of technological innovation and globalization, resources and factors have achieved large-scale cross-border movement. In state-to-state relations, mutual benefits shall replace zero-sum games. And the interests of China and the U.S. are deeply intertwined and dependent on each other. and cooperation is mutually beneficial, and fighting each other is mutually destructive. The two sides should work together to explore the path of win-win cooperation, which is in line with the trend of the times. And it's in the interest of the two peoples of China and the U.S. and people of the world. China and the U.S. currently have a wide range of common interests in bilateral and global affairs, and we shall strengthen cooperation in those key areas to transform the potential for cooperation into the momentum of the development of our bilateral relations.
So in the following areas, we can step up cooperation. First, we can strengthen anti-COVID cooperation. COVID variants and rapid spread have posed serious threats to the life and security of all nations. This is the biggest single challenge facing the whole world. China and the US should strengthen cooperation under the guidance of the WHO and jointly promote the development of vaccines and medicine and raise information transparency and data sharing standards. Enhance the equity of the international distribution of vaccines. Coordinate cross-border travels to help the world emerge from COVID as soon as possible. Second, I think we should also strengthen cooperation on climate actions through joint efforts. Last year, the two sides issued the China-U.S. joint statement addressing the climate crisis and the U.S.-China joint Glasgow declaration, laying down a key foundation for the deep-going climate cooperation between the two countries. Combined, our carbon emissions exceed 40% of the world's total. We should join hands to strengthen cooperation on climate action, accelerate green and low carbon transition and technological innovation, to lead by example for the rest of the world. Third, we should strengthen trade and economic cooperation. Trade and economic cooperation is the ballast and propeller of China-U.S. relations. Despite the impact of COVID and other factors, in 2020, China once again became the U.S.'s largest trading partner. Last year, China-U.S. total imports and exports were up 28.7% year-on-year, which fully speaks to the intertwined and mutually supportive trade and economic relations between the two sides and their huge resilience and potentials. China is pursuing opening up on larger scale, in broader scope, and at a deeper level, which will create greater development opportunities for business communities across the world, including that of the United States. Number four, I think we should strengthen science and technology cooperation. In recent years, some in the US government has been politicizing tech issues, building walls, decoupling, and blocking in this area, which brings adverse impact on our cooperative R&D efforts. According to US media, 60% of US respondents support close cooperation with Chinese tech companies. I hope the US can view the situation fairly, open up and tear down walls and stop irrational suppression and restriction of Chinese tech companies and jointly promote science and technology progress for humanity. Number five, we should strengthen global governance cooperation. The pandemic shows once again that all countries in the world are in a community of a shared future that rises and falls together. Multilateralism is the only feasible option to take on global challenges. China and the United States should work together to uphold the global multilateral trading system with the United Nations at the core and the World Bank, IMF, and WTO as key pillars. Fully tap into the role of multilateral institutions such as the G20 maintain fair and just international order and provide more public goods for the world. Distinguished guests, I think mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation are the principles that China and the US should observe in their interactions. They also provide important reference for all nations in the world as two big countries. China and the United States should take responsibilities and lead by example. I believe as long as we abide by and implement these three principles, we can move China-US relationship onto the right track to the benefit of both countries and the whole world. I wish this forum a complete success. Thank you.
We thank Mr. Zheng Peiyan for speaking to us and also for the great honor of listening to your insights as you bring this first session of this conference to a close. Thank you again to Mr. Zheng Peiyan and also to our other speakers, to Mary Robinson, to Mr. Go Chok Tong, to Mr. Jean Chrétien, of course, to Mr. Yasuo Fukuda, and also to Mr. Steve Orlins.